are under attack. Never before in American history have we faced such a tremendous threat to our individual liberty. Our rights to life, liberty, and property are all at stake. And this is a struggle that those who advocate taking away our individual liberty are zealous, they're dedicated to doing it, and they are among our ranks. They are here in this country, and they are all around us. And many are misguided. All of them are ultimately dedicated to the same end, and they're pursuing it through many different angles. Let's take a look at the different angles. Well, we have a border crisis, and that border crisis is based on the fact that our government, starting with the President of the United States, has dedicated himself to abandoning the law, violating the immigration laws, acting in an unconstitutional manner, violating his oath of office to ensure that the laws be faithfully executed, and in addition, his Article 2 requirements as president to enforce the laws. But he's not only abandoned enforcement of our immigration laws to allow what will soon be coming up from Mexico, 85,000 illegal Haitians into the country, atop the 200,000 plus illegal aliens who came in last month. But he's also turned over border control to illegal cartels south of the border, who largely determine who comes in. And he's allowed fentanyl to pour into this country in huge quantities, logically causing the deaths of Americans all over the United States. And he's allowed sex trafficking to go unchecked. And he's allowed drug trafficking to go unchecked. And he's allowed MS-13 to come into this country through the southern border. And he's allowed terrorists to come in to the United States through the southern border. Now, his fundamental legal obligation is to protect the United States. And he's abdicated that role. Now, this is not a flight of fancy. This is intentional. Now, let's take a look at something else. Our public schools in urban areas around the country are adopting essentially the same curriculum, and that's called critical race theory. Critical race theory teaches our children to hate themselves, to hate each other, to hate their country, and to hate the free market. Now, those who are brought up in this educational system and who subscribe to it will end up not defending their country, not becoming captains of industry, but becoming servants of the state. They will be dependents because they've been taught, if they're children of color, that no matter what they do, no matter what talents they have, no matter what they can learn, it doesn't matter. Because as children of color, they will always be victimized in America. They're taught that there's no opportunity in this country for them. And they're taught that every institution, whether it's government or the private sector, is systemically and irredeemably racist. And therefore, they cannot succeed. They can try, but they'll never succeed. When you indoctrinate children from kindergarten all the way through college with this indoctrination, this Marxist indoctrination, as we will see, you destroy their ambition. You make them interested in one of two things: either giving up entirely and becoming dependents of the state, or revolting and becoming revolutionaries. Now, they also teach children who are not of color or white. I thought white was a color too, but they teach children who are white that no matter what they do, no matter how good a person they are, they will always oppress people of color. It's in their DNA. They're systemically racist. It's the nature of being white. You will stand out to those of color, and that will shame them. This is what they teach children in our schools. This is an indoctrination that is based on Marxist critical race theory, Marxist critical theory in the law schools when I was going to law school. This idea that rather than the oppressed and oppressors being based on economics, oppressed and oppressor is just shifted to be based on race. Now this is an intentional thing. I don't know if I can find that little, there it is. This is an intentional thing, as you'll soon see from some of these slides. Is this the right thing? Yeah. All right, those are two examples. But then we have numerous other ones that are happening in the Congress of the United States. We have a Congress dominated by politicians who favor socialism. We had a presidential campaign in which the leaders of the Democratic Party, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, said within one day of one another, towards the end of the Democratic campaign season, that if a socialist were nominated, they would support that socialist, that they would put the whole backing of the Democratic Party behind that socialist. And they said this publicly. That is unprecedented. The first time in American history where the leaders of a political party that is a major party, not the Progressive Party, not the Socialist Party, but a major party endorsed socialism as a platform for the nation. And so President Biden sold his soul to the socialists, and he promised them that he would implement their plan. He also promised us that he wouldn't. But whose plan's being implemented? Theirs. And so when we look at this economic situation, we just looked at a $3.5 trillion bill in Congress that would, if it were passed, and they're not going away because they're going to come back and try to pass it again, would have radically transformed our entire country into a nation of dependency and into a nation that so heavily taxes the most productive elements and redistributes it, that it would ruin the free market system. Now, these are not things that they don't think will happen. These are things that they know will happen. These are intentional acts to destroy the United States. These are a few. I could go on. There are so many happening. Let's talk about the states and localities. In urban areas across the United States, we saw last year, continuing all the way up to the present, lawlessness in the streets. We saw buildings being looted. We saw arson taking place. We saw murder. We see a 30% rise in the incidence of murder in the United States over last year. And we see virtually no effective law enforcement. Now, under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, the federal government is required to guarantee the states a Republican form of government. It's not an option for the states to avoid a Republican form. The Constitution mandates it. The Constitution in that same section gives the federal government the power to use the military to quell an insurrection. And in fact, it specifically talks about instances in which the states themselves will not quell the insurrection. And so, what happened? Did we see the Insurrection Act invoked? Did we see federal troops go to Portland? Did we see federal troops go to Los Angeles? Did we see federal troops go to Chicago? Did we see federal troops go to Minneapolis? Did we see them go anywhere in the United States where private property owners' property was being burned, where people were being shot and murdered, where people were being harassed and beaten, where people were being accused and threatened, where people who owned property were told that they would have that property taken away, where people just innocently eating at a restaurant had their tables overturned, had people threaten them, and had people abuse them? Did we see the police? Did we see the federal government? Did we see anyone act against it? And why is that? Because those in government had sympathy with them. Because the Marxism that drives BLM and ANTIFA is not an ideology those who are in power oppose. Because the ultimate end that these people seek is an end that doesn't frustrate or offend them. And so the overthrow of the United States government, which is the logical consequence of allowing people to roam the streets, destroy private property, ruin people's businesses, take their private property, attack government, burn down government buildings, burn down police buildings, is something they don't oppose. That means the end of the rule of law. That means the end of defense of individual liberty. That means the end of the defense of private property. And that means the end of defense of life, even to the extent of ultimately asking, as this administration is, that you give up your Second Amendment rights to defend yourself, your family, and a free country. All right. The preamble to the Declaration of Independence. This is the definition of what it means to be an American. There's an American ethos. We have a history, a tradition that defines us based on these Jeffersonian principles, ultimately Lockean principles. This is who we are. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The truths are self-evident. These are foundational principles. This defines what it means to be an American. If you subscribe to these views, you have historically had this American ethos, this raison d'etre of being American. The rest of the world understands these principles to define America, even to this day. This is who we are. We're a free people. We're a free people with equal justice under law. We are a free people that bases our understanding that all men, and by the way, if you look at Jefferson's understanding of the language he used in writing this and of the contemporaneous language that defines it, men was not limited to men, as the critical race theory people teach. It's humankind. It's all people. It's even slaves. Because in a 168-word paragraph that was in the original Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson at the time he penned those words, he included this. He blamed King George III for waging cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, capturing and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This practical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of England, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, as prostituted as negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of the people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Jefferson wrote the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, mindful of the fact that slaves in this country were unjustly deprived of their liberty. The concept of liberty in the preamble applies to all people. Now, this history is rewritten by the advocates of critical race theory. Our children are being taught that America was racist at its founding. They're being taught that America wasn't founded in 1776, that America was founded in 1619 in the Jamestown colony. And they're told a lie about the Jamestown colony. They're told that the Jamestown colony enslaved 20 black slaves, and that whites enslaved blacks, and that's the origin of it, and that that's the history in this country, that whites enslaved blacks. Now that's true, whites did enslave blacks. By the time of the American Civil War, there were 4 million people in bondage. Now it never sat well with Jefferson, who opposed it. It never sat well with James Madison, who opposed it. It never sat well with George Washington, who opposed it. They all wanted a political end to the institution of slavery. That's not told. But also it's a lie to say that only blacks were enslaved in the United States. The actual history is that 4 months before the 20 blacks arrived on the Jamestown colony, 100 whites from Bridewell in London were shipped over here and enslaved. There were 100 whites enslaved by the time the 20 blacks arrived in Jamestown. And after that, the 20 blacks arrived, it was a one-off. For many years, the only slaves coming to Jamestown were white. There were tens of thousands of whites enslaved in the United States by the time of the Civil War. There were tens of thousands of whites. There were many Irish slaves. In fact, Irish slaves, which were drummed out through ethnic cleansing by Cromwell in Ireland and sent here as a punishment, Irish slaves were the least expensive to buy at the auction block and were therefore among the most mistreated slaves. It was more expensive to buy a black slave than it was to buy an Irish slave. And the consequence of that was, if anything, those Irish who were enslaved were mistreated as badly as blacks were mistreated. Now, this horrible stain of slavery does not define us as a people. Martin Luther King's language defines us as a people. The Declaration of Independence defines us as a people. Martin Luther King told us to judge people not based on the color of the skin, but on the character of the person. And Martin Luther King didn't reject the Declaration of Independence. He didn't reject the Constitution. He said that all people that black people need to be have that as part of their inheritance too. And so he advocated civil rights. What we have now is not an advocacy of civil rights, but an advocacy of a new slavery, an advocacy of slavery to the state, an advocacy of slavery to the state based on a separation of the races. Do you realize at Washington University, right now in Oregon, they have segregated blacks on campus and put them in a separate dorm and have a separate area on campus that is blacks only. They say this is necessary to build the culture of a black community independent of the white oppression that surrounds them. Segregation, which we thought we destroyed with the civil rights movement, is being reinvigorated and used as a new tool that is designed to continue the notion of racism in perpetuity and to become a foundation of all law in this country. It is an evil. It is despicable. All men, meaning all humankind, all of us, are created equal. The superficiality of pigment is that, superficial. And to use a superficiality to give us different privileges is absolutely the bane of liberty and is the way to ruin us and to bring about a new slavery in America. The irony is they use a condemnation of slavery as a vehicle to condemn whites and to say that blacks are hopelessly oppressed by a systemically racist society. But did they get rid of racism? No. They use it to bring about a new form of slavery called socialism. And it's not really socialism. It's communism. It's Marxism. Now, what are they about? This is BLM and ANTIFA in their own words. Breaking windows is a way to challenge the absurd notion that the social contract of property rights is more important than the needs of the people around us. Anyone who truly desires to see an end to property destruction should hasten to bring about the end of property itself. Then, at least, the only reason to break windows would be thrill-seeking. ANTIFA member who wrote Why We Break Windows, The Effectiveness of Political Vandalism. Patrice Cullors, who founded BLM. We are trained Marxists. Sean King, a major BLM activist. I think the statues of the white European they claim is Jesus should come down. They are a form of white supremacy, always have been. And so they have looted and destroyed churches all across the United States. People don't hear about this. This isn't in the news. But hundreds of churches all across the United States have been subject to vandalism, burning, statues have been destroyed, defaced, as part of their movement. Because as good Marxists, they're atheists. They don't believe in God, but they don't believe that you should have a right to believe in God. And then destroying property which can be replaced is not violence. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who created the 1619 Project for the New York Times. Not violence. To destroy people's property is not violence. No, it's equity. It's social justice. You see, once we accept that the nation is systemically racist, and that the whites are the oppressors, and that people of color are the oppressed, that logically leads to the conclusion that we must overthrow white society. That nothing a white person has is justifiably his or hers. That it must be taken and redistributed. That equity or social justice requires this. And that if you, as a white person, disagree, well, you're a racist. The brilliance of Margaret Thatcher lives on. So the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. And some socialists seem to believe that people should be numbers in a state computer. We believe they should be individuals. We are all unequal, and that's true. We're created equal, but we have different talents. To deny that we have different talents, or to deny us the right to the fruits of our labor based on our different talents, is to destroy our liberty. It's also to destroy our incentive to produce, and it leads to universal misery. I think every day, as Margaret Thatcher does, she says, we are all unequal. No one, thank heavens, is like anyone else, however much the socialists may pretend otherwise. We believe that everyone has the right to be unequal, but to us, every human being is equally important. And that's the point. We have equal justice under law. Each of us is different. You know, I won't require you to run and win a marathon for the right to have rights. But I will defend to the death the right of the person to run the marathon so that they can prove that they can run it faster than anybody else. And I don't care what color they are. I want to see an American win. I believe that all Americans are created equal. I don't want to hear any more of this nonsense about race as a basis to distinguish us. It is a humiliating and wretched thing to categorize people based on an immutable characteristic and say that they're either entitled to rights or not entitled to rights. And to have this as a part of our country, makes our country unrecognizable. It's unrecognizable from the most wretched places on earth. It becomes unrecognizable from Nazi Germany. It becomes unrecognizable from Stalin's Russia. It becomes the Soviet Union. It becomes unrecognizable to Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia. This is how they bring about the revolution. They pit us against ourselves. We should know better. Our children don't. And so what do we have to do? We have to educate our children. They're not getting it in the public schools. We have to take it upon ourselves to impart to them this thing. When the nation was in the New Nation period, they had this thing that has subsequently been called Republican motherhood, because most children at that time were homeschooled. Almost all children were homeschooled. All the way up until the 20th century, they were homeschooled. And it was a fundamental element of homeschooling in America by parents, that they reminded children of the American Revolution. They reminded children of these core principles in the Declaration of Independence. And why are those core principles so extraordinary? What is it about history that people have forgotten? Let me tell you. Where do these rights come from? What is the ideological origin of the United States? Why is the United States one of the greatest nations on earth? The greatest nation on earth, until this rotten doctrine of socialism has become so pervasive. We've got to get rid of it. We can be the greatest nation on earth. There is no limit to the possibilities that we have. And why? Because there's a genius event that took place in world history, and it started in England. In England, in the late 17th century, Sir Robert Filmer wrote a book called Patriarcha. He did this to defend what was called the divine right of kings. You see, in England, at the time, the king was under siege. They were going to behead Charles I. Parliament had risen in defense of the rights of the people against a tyrant king. And they had a civil war with the parliamentarians against those defending the crown, and they had a civil war based on that. And out of the Civil War came a philosophy that overthrew this notion of divine right of kings. Under divine right of kings, only the king has rights. Under socialism, only the state defines what rights are. You only have rights if the state grants you those rights. Otherwise, if the state is not determined that it is for the public good, you have no rights. And so what happened in England was that they overthrew the divine right of kings based on the principles of liberty, based on a new movement that arose in the 18th century that is best expressed by the group called the Radical Whigs. The Radical Whigs were the opposition political movement to the Hanoverian kings. From 1720 to 1723, 144 letters on liberty, called Cato's Letters, were published serially in the London Gazette. Those letters defined individual liberty. They expressed what had become a popular movement, the idea that rights come from God and are not just given to the king, but are given to every person. That all of us are born with unalienable rights. They may not be taken away from us by the state. And that concept was revolutionary. And it gave birth to the foundation of the United States. All across the colonies, from Savannah to Boston, whenever there was an instance of colonial suppression of rights, whenever people were prosecuted for seditious libel, Alexander McDougall, prosecuted in Boston, John Peter Zenger, prosecuted for seditious libel, many others prosecuted for seditious libel. That it means criticism of government. In response to those prosecutions, the people rose up in defense of liberty. They republished Cato's letters again and again and again and again. Then we have the American Revolution. Then we have Thomas Paine. We have common sense. We have all of this rhetoric backed by action in defense of liberty against tyranny, all to fight for the right for each of us to have our God-given rights protected against tyranny. Marxists get up early in the morning to further their cause. We must get up even earlier to defend our freedoms. And that is so true now. As my colleague, who's the opinion editor for the Washington Times, Cheryl Chumley, writes, socialists don't sleep. They are relentless. They mean to destroy this country. And if we don't act against it, they will. They're a minority, but so are the Bolsheviks. They are a minority, but they'll throw Molotov cocktails. They'll burn buildings down. They will loot buildings. They will destroy people's lives. They will use defamation with wild abandon to ruin people. They will do whatever is necessary to achieve their end. They will lie, they will cheat, they will steal. There is no ethics to socialism. There is only one goal: total state control. They want to control how you run their lives so they have power and freedom and you don't. What about this great example of declamation of power? So we have this huge principle in favor of individual liberty that we should celebrate in our schools, we should teach to our children, we should make a part of our everyday lives. We should remind ourselves again and again, we are a free people. We will not be slaves. We will not discriminate based on race. We will not discriminate based on immutable characteristics. We will be a free people of justice, of equal justice under law. And we won't let socialists take that away from us. We will not live to see that taken away from us. We have died in foreign soil over and over again when that threat has been presented, and we have to be willing to do that here. So, in 1783, after British Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown on October 18, 1781, King George III has Benjamin West, who's a painter for the crown, with him. George III asks, what will become of General Washington now that the war is over? You see, George III thought that inevitably someone who had acquired that degree of power, George Washington, by the way, had become an international cause célèbre. He was known through the courts of France, through all of Europe and England and the world as this extraordinary figure who brought an empire to its knees. George III thought, if I were George Washington, and he had delusions that he was when he became batty, if I were George Washington, I know what I would do with that power. I would be the most powerful person on earth. I would command the entire government. I would be an absolute monarch. Charles I thought he could be an absolute monarch. I would be that monarch. Look what Washington has before him. And so he expects an answer that Washington is going to become the new king of America. And there was much talk of Washington becoming king. But what does Benjamin West say? They say he will return to his farm. He's going to retire. He's going to declaim all of this power. He's giving it up because he believes fundamentally in liberty. He believes in the principles of liberty. This is greatness. And George III knew it. Flabbergasted, he says, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. There's Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, the Guarantee Clause. Now, as I explain in the Authoritarians, socialism is not new to America. Not at all. When you look at our history, it's interesting to see that the defenders of slavery in the antebellum South defended slavery based on socialism. There's a man named Friedrich Hegel, and he came up with collectivism, the underpinning of socialism and communism. In fact, one of his students was Karl Marx. And he taught that there was no more laudable end or justifiable end for mankind than to serve the state. He recreated patriarcha with modern language. He said in an age of industrialization, it's increasingly important that we have order, that we have control, that we have direction, that we have professional correction of our lay ways, because now professions are prolific. Now it's possible to have engineers and scientists with the Industrial Revolution. And so we can take these experts and they can rule us. And they will know better than we do what is in our best interest, because they are expert and we're not. So we should turn over governance to the experts. And in Bismarck's Germany, they did just that. They created an administrative state. And Hegel advocated the administrative state. And professors teaching Hegelian communism advocated this same thing for the world. And it became a focal point of the new sciences, the new political science, which didn't exist before that time, the new sociology, the new criminology, the new philosophies of the modern era. Academics from America, from all of the major universities, flocked to Berlin, flocked to Heidelberg, flocked to other parts of Germany to go to the historic schools and learn this new philosophy. And there they were taught, much as the pro-slavery people understood, to hate the Declaration of Independence, to hate that concept that all men are created equal, to hate the idea that we have unalienable rights, to hate the idea that we are sovereign and that the state is our servant, and to accept that in an age of increasing complexity, of modernity and the Industrial Revolution, that cannot exist, that instead you need the state to run things in the right way using experts, and that it was not good to have political control of experts. They needed to be independent of politics. They needed to have their own politics. They needed to have their own government. They needed to directly regulate us, and they needed to be unanswerable to anyone for it. They needed authoritarian power. They needed it because that is the way you get to the common good the fastest. That's the most expeditious way to get to the common good. Let them define the common good. Let them force us to achieve it. This would create this great new society. This is communism. This is what BLM advocates. This is what Antifa advocates. This is what Nancy Pelosi sympathizes with. This is what Chuck Schumer sympathizes with. This is what the President of the United States has sold his soul to achieve. Now, so we have here the creation of an administrative state. It happened by people who knew what they were doing. They knew that they were circumventing the Constitution. They intended it. Woodrow Wilson intended for the administrative state to be a government outside of the limits of the Constitution. He wanted it to have legislative, executive, and judicial power without check from the branches of government in the Constitution, to be unlimited in its power. They openly advocated unlimited government power. And they created the administrative state, beginning in the 1880s on the federal level, and continuing through the New Deal, where hundreds of them were created, all the way to the present, where there are hundreds and hundreds of administrative agencies, thousands and thousands, if you look at the states as well, that operate outside the checks and balances of the Constitution and that regulate our everyday lives. 9/10 of all federal laws, not the product of those we elect. It's the product of the unelected heads of the administrative agencies. If you have a problem with government, chances are you're not running into conflict with the Justice Department over enforcement of a law. You're running into EPA, OSHA. And we'll talk about that in a minute. You're running into regulatory agencies that have unlimited power. If you're accused by an administrative agency, you don't have a presumption of innocence. You're presumed guilty until you prove yourself innocent. If you are brought before an administrative law judge and you are charged, those charges can mutate based on whatever the government wants to charge you based on the flow of the case. That's not possible in a court, Article 3 court. You can have a new charge brought against you in an administrative tribunal all the way up to the day of decision. You have a constantly moving target. You are. And so there's no justice in that. The prosecutor in an administrative court is also the judge. The party that brings the charges are the political heads of the agency. The party that prosecutes you are the agents of the political heads of the agency. When you lose an administrative trial, you appeal to the agency heads. The agency heads brought the charges against you. What do you think the probability of justice in that system is? It is very nearly zero. And that's where most of us end up when we run into government. And it's not just at the federal level, it's also at the state level. You have no right to a trial by jury. You have no right to know who your accusers are. You have no right against general warrants. The Fourth Amendment was passed by the framers, was a part of the Constitution for the very purpose of preventing unlimited warrants, that is, unlimited subpoenas that could get every bit of information, all your financial records, whether it's relevant to a case or not. Administrative agencies of the federal and state governments have that power now in violation of the Fourth Amendment. So they created the administrative state. James Madison reminded us at the start of this great nation, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. And based on that, we have tyranny. We're warned by those who have been among the greatest Americans to lead us that freedom must be forever. You know, Lincoln said to us that freedom was a very precious thing. He spoke in his Lyceum address to youth. We're interested in having him answer a question, which is, will we always be free? And he said, we are the author and finisher of our freedom. No foreign power will take it away from us. We will be forever free, or we will destroy our freedom ourselves. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of the free, we must live through all time or die by suicide. The defense of liberty. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. So we have to rise up. We can't afford to be silent. We are a majority. Most Americans oppose socialism. Most Americans love liberty. We are in the majority by far. We have a vocal, activist, violent minority that is sympathized with by our national leaders, by local leaders in the cities of this country. And they don't represent us. They are not standing for the basic principles that our country was founded upon. They're destroying them. And we can make a difference. You see, I'll give you one example. We have this mandate, the mask mandate, right? And someone's got to keep track of time for me because I'm losing track of time. How much time do we have left? 7 minutes? Okay. 10 minutes, okay. Any more? So, we have this mask mandate, an enormous authoritarian grab, power grab, cynically done. President of the United States sinking in the polls rapidly because of this horrendous debacle in Afghanistan where he abandoned Americans, abandoned SIV holders, abandoned green card holders, abandoned our allies, cut and run was his policy, humiliated our troops, not one of which under the command level would have followed this, humiliating and disgusting that General Milley, that General McKenzie, that Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, would have implemented an order they knew and recommended against and knew would cause us these enormous hardships, anticipated the hostage taking, anticipated the rise of terrorism, and did nothing to stand in the way of it by doing the honorable thing, which would have been to resign. And that's right. Let me get to you just, I'm going to have a question or two. So, what about this mandate? The mandate is unconstitutional. There is no federal police power. There is no federal police power. The Supreme Court in Jacobson, a decision I oppose, but the Supreme Court in Jacobson ruled that the power to mandate vaccination was a state police power reserved to the states under the Constitution. He usurped the state's power unilaterally as a dictator. He not only usurped the state's power, but this is a legislative power. It's inherently a legislative act. And he therefore violated the separation of powers because he took that power from Congress. He is ruling like a dictator. He's doing it for his own political advantage, but it's backfiring miserably. And the reason why it's backfiring is that it's transparently cynical. He's exempted the entire United States Post Office from this mandate, and they go to your door every day. He's exempted every one of the illegal aliens coming into this country, and one of the greatest imports into this country is COVID now. And he's exempted the White House, and he's exempted the courts, and he's exempted Congress. And the reason why he's done this is because this is a political move. This isn't sincere move. This isn't scientific. Look, if you have a force of over 100 people working in your company, and there are 50 that are vaccinated and there are 50 that are unvaccinated, you mean to tell me that the 50 that are unvaccinated pose a threat to the 50 that are vaccinated? And then what about natural immunity? Here's the thing. Under the standard that he has to satisfy, there are two elements, and he won't satisfy them. And they know this in advance. That's why Ron Klain, his White House Chief of Staff, said, this is the ultimate workaround. Workaround what? The Constitution. It's the ultimate workaround the Constitution. Why is it a workaround the Constitution? Because this was going to be a direct executive action. The only way they could get a direct executive action was to make it an OSHA thing and apply it in the workforce under Section 6C1 of the OSHA Act. And under that section, however, they fail the mark miserably. And the reason is there are two elements they have to satisfy. First, under that statutory provision, you have to show that this agent that is a threat in the workforce poses a grave danger. A grave danger the Fifth Circuit has defined as a mortal threat. It can't be hypothetically in distant level of causation ultimately a threat. It has to be a grave and immediate threat to the workforce. Now, do people with natural immunity pose a grave threat? How about people who work from home remotely? Do they pose a grave threat? What about truck drivers who go around the country alone in a cab? Do they pose a grave threat? Even with the general population of people, they're young people in the workforce. They ordinarily have disease with a relatively short likelihood of death. And you can't say that with every individual employee there's a grave threat there either. So when you take into account all of these things, there are massive exceptions that have to be imposed here. Not only that, the second part of the test is that this requirement is necessary. And the courts have interpreted that to mean absolutely necessary, meaning if there are other alternatives to termination, you have to take advantage of that. If it eliminates the grave threat, you could allow that instead. And then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act under Title I. And all those people who are immune compromised or otherwise vulnerable because of pre-existing conditions, they have to be able to be opted out of that because this is a regulation and that's a statutory requirement and they have to accommodate that. In addition, under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, anyone who has a religious scruple against vaccination cannot be terminated lawfully under the Civil Rights Act. And so that would be another basis. When you get done with this awful totalitarian move by Joe Biden, you end up not with a brick wall against employment, but with Swiss cheese. But in the interim, he's achieving that socialist objective. He's driving out of the workforce employees all across this country. He's causing people who are fearful of what's going to happen to them with their jobs to give up those jobs and to go to work for somebody else. He's creating massive disruption in the marketplace. He's making it very, very difficult for people to make it. And then there are all those who are employed in the public sector where he has governors and mayors doing his bidding in the states, ruining their jobs, ruining their future. If you ever thought these people had 1 degree, 1 iota of respect and concern for the individual in America, You should rule that out. Because they don't care if you lose your job. They don't care if illegal aliens rob destroy your property. They don't care if drugs come into this country, fentanyl included. They don't care if there's sex trafficking. They don't care. As long as they get more power, as long as they gain more control. So the moral of the story is we have to stand up. And what do we have to do? You have to become vocal. You can't be a silent majority anymore. You have to have your opinions in favor of freedom communicated. You have to go out there to those school board meetings and oppose the school board. You got to vote against them. You have to vote for the recall efforts or start them. You got to run for the school board to get critical race theory out. You have to vote in the opposite of these people who are socialists, which happens to be the Republican Party. You have to vote them into office in 2022. We have to have a Republican House and a Republican Senate because they're the party opposing this. We've got to do it to save our individual liberty. And we have to be mindful of the fact that the next generation is coming along and they are training the next generation to be Marxists. And you as a parent have more power in your hands to reverse that than anybody else can. And that's where we have to win. And when it comes to your own property in the face of all this threat, you have to understand what the Second Amendment means, and you have to acquire a weapon. You've got to defend yourself. You have to defend your family. You can't count on the police. And when it comes to the opportunity to vote out these district attorneys and state's attorneys that George Soros put in, you got to vote them out. You got to recall them. You got to start a recall to do it. So we, unfortunately, rightly disgusted by politics, have to become politicians. We have to do that individually. We have to find where we can make a difference in fighting this and do it. We can express ourselves with Unvaccinated Lives Matter. We can express ourselves with t-shirts, with various ways of communicating, and we can also do it by educating, and we can also do it by communicating, and we need to do it by action. So, I love this country. I know you love this country. There's nothing I wouldn't do to defend this country. And there's nothing you wouldn't do to defend your country either. So let's turn that into action. Let's make a difference. Thank you.